Hi, I'm Shan Wu with a under color of law analysis of the most recent Supreme Court decision which allowed the Trump regime to do some funding cuts, specifically in education. So there's big coverage on this when it came out, but let's talk about what it is and what it is not. So the first thing that's important to know is simply what was the decision, which is it allowed the continued freeze of $65 million for teacher training and professional development. A lower court had frozen that freeze, said you can't do that, Trump administration, and the Education Department was appealing that, and interesting piece about the appeal we'll talk about, but the appeal reached the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you can't freeze this right now. Now, what's interesting about that appeal is it was an appeal of a TRO, our friend, the temporary restraining order, and those actually aren't appealable. But there's been such a massive flurry of these cases going on that some appellate courts and the Supreme Court, obviously here, are kind of allowing these unusual situations where they would actually consider the TRO. Normally what would happen is the TRO stays in place, it's not appealable, you get to the preliminary injunction, which is a bit more substantive, and that can be appealed. So that's the first thing to know. This is a little bit unusual that it was a TRO, but it reached the Supreme Court. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation about what the court was doing here. So let's start with the queen of disinformation. Attorney General Pam Bondi says in the statement about the ruling that it, quote, vindicates what the Department of Justice has been arguing for months. Local district judges do not have the jurisdiction to seize control of taxpayer dollars, force the government to pay out billions, or unilaterally halt President Trump's policy agenda. No, that's completely wrong on her part. So first of all, they absolutely do have that jurisdiction to make decisions about specific cases. All right, the judges themselves are not seizing control of anybody's taxpayer dollars. They're not really forcing the government to pay out billions, except to hold the government to decisions it already made to pay out those billions. For example, Congress has appropriated them. They're deciding individual cases, and that's very important for us to keep our eye on. So note that this was what's called a per curiam decision. It was unsigned. It's meant to give the appearance of them all being joined at the hip. However, sometimes there can be dissenting opinions. So here, for the majority, it was 5-4. Nobody signs that opinion. It's just put out there, and it says that they're going to unfreeze the freeze. Chief Justice Roberts dissented, but he did not write an opinion. So that means it's 5-4, and they were writing here on a very narrow issue, and there were some dissents from Justice Jackson that Sotomayor joined with, and also Kagan gave a written dissent explaining why mostly they thought it was inappropriate for the Supreme Court to intervene at this early stage, because they don't normally take appeals from a TRO. Now, the important point here is it's not a big decision about all funding cuts and all the Trump executive orders with regard to funding. I mean, we all kind of wish there could be one single case like that, cuts a broad swath, says striking down all this nonsense you're doing with funding, all of what DOJ is doing. And, kind of like Attorney General Bondi wishes that too. She would want to wish the decision into something substantive, but it's not that substantive. It specifically says we're going to take this appeal of the TRO, and then you have to look at specifically what they're saying. It's actually a very technical decision where they talk about which courts can have further jurisdiction over this, whether it has to go to the administrative system of courts, but it's very, very narrow. True, right now, the U.S. government, the Education Department, can continue to withhold this funding, which is really nonsensical. I mean, why would you not want to train teachers and allow them to have professional development? We'll get into why you might want that in a moment. But the first point is really to emphasize how nonsensical, untrue is Attorney General Bondi's statement. Because if the Supreme Court really had said that in this case, gee, how come there's still some 140 lawsuits across the country all stopping or trying to stop the regime's efforts to do various things through executive orders? We'll put up a chart here, which is kind of helpful, a pie chart, to show just how many there are. And Let's ask, how many of these cases does this Supreme Court case resolve? Answer, 0. Doesn't resolve any of them. It's just this very narrow point. And the decision is going to come back. They're going to keep appealing it. It's going to continue to be litigated. That's what the case says. But in the meantime, this $65 million doesn't get sent. Part of the SCOTUS's rationale here, which I thought was kind of silly too, but is they said once that money was distributed, it'd be kind of hard for the government to pull it back. And they seem to think that was problematic for it. It seems like it's also very hard to train the people after they haven't been trained with those funds. The important thing to keep in mind is how piecemeal all this fighting is, and it has to be that way. It can take sometimes years of litigation and many, many cases before a Supreme Court case really gets teed up to really decide a big issue. Let's use the obvious example of the overruling of Roe v. Wade. That took decades of cases, work by the Federalist Society to sew all the right judges in place, but they kept looking for cases constantly to bring up. Some of them got their way up there and the court ducked it or made a very minor change. It's not like you just find this one case you bring up there and kaboom, everything changes. Even now, with this very conservative bench, it's not entirely clear always which way they're going to go. Obviously, Justice Amy Coney Barrett has become somewhat of a swing vote. Roberts tries to be a swing vote at times too, when he's making his rather feeble attempts to protect the legitimacy of the court. But it doesn't come that easily for either side, frankly. So here's some things to take away in terms of an optimistic perspective on the legal issues here. So first, all of this litigation really slows down the Trump attempt to do their blitzkrieg. It may feel like a lightning shock and awe phenomenon as we get overwhelmed by all these stories, but they are absolutely getting bogged down by the litigation, which is what litigation tends to do. Honestly, it may be halfway to the midterms or in midterms by the time some of these real substantive rulings make it to the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court to really come down with something that's going to say absolutely no on certain things or absolutely yes. And there's a whole lot of TROs and preliminary injunctions along the way. That's really important, actually, because of the careful record building that's going on here. These lawyers who are bringing these cases to stop the Trump regime, they have to present the evidence. They're going to be having hearings. All of that's critical. It makes an evidentiary record as well as a legal record. So by the time something does get to the Supreme Court, and remember, we don't know which ones are going to get there yet, so you got to make the best records, the best law in all of these. By the time it gets there, it will have the best chance of beating the Trump regime's arguments for this. Now, we might ask in the meantime, is education going to survive? I mean, we've got the education department kind of being disbanded, hundreds of millions in funding cut. And you do sort of wonder what it is that the Trump regime's trying to do here with that, right? They're telling big universities as well, same kind of strategy they're using with big law firms. You better cut out your DEI. They're cutting funding, like Columbia lost hundreds of millions in funding. And some of them are going to cave. I mean, Columbia looks like they cut a deal. Next up is going to be Harvard. Now, this is not that easy of a situation for the universities, much like it isn't that cut and dry for the big law firms. Many of them do have enormous endowments. We know about that. But I just want to point out, we have to be cautious about saying, oh, just use up some of your endowment. A lot of that endowment's rather earmarked. It's tied up. You can't just take the money that was earmarked for like the new science project and redistribute it to doing scholarships for students, anything like that. So a lot of it is complicated, but it does come down to the question of, if you have billions in your endowment, why don't you have a little bit more backbone to weather this storm? So that obviously is still going to be a question for universities, just like in big law. Now, you might wonder, why does Trump want to cut funding for medical research? Because so much of that funding is there. It's really, in my opinion, because it's leverage on the universities. And, of course, he and his folks don't care if people get hurt when you're no longer doing research on cutting-edge treatments or funding any existing treatments or finding new treatments. They don't really care about that. It's just leverage to them. Now, in the meantime, you might also take a look at what is the bigger picture in why you want to put leverage on education. So, for example, what's the U.S. Naval Academy just doing? Well, now they've banned books about DEI, even about the Holocaust. And you might wonder why they want to do that. Well, there's a very long tradition here in authoritarian regimes of wanting to attack the indoctrination aspect, to push that on how you control people's education. The U.S. Naval Academy, it's like 381 DI books have been removed, including Maya Angelou's memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird, saying, I mean, please give me a break. This was the first nonfiction bestseller by a black woman. She was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, Tony Award, Presidential Medal of Freedom, first black woman to be minted onto U.S. currency. But yeah, now let's ban her memoir, and let's make sure that the midshipmen cannot read about the Holocaust. I mean, they may as well just hold a book burning party at this point. But it is about the indoctrination. A great article in Atlantic, actually a podcast they did, we'll put it up for you, making the point that in many other countries, they want to attack the universities first to control the thinking and to control how people will be able to think. So here, what you want to do, right, start with the very young, go all the way up to the military academies and to graduate schools. What kind of institution might take that place? Well, in this podcast, they give a couple of ideas. One would be a place like Hillsdale, small Christian college, does not accept federal funding, right? Because under other administrations, no leverage on them. That might be why they had a good defense when they got sued in 2023 for failing to really protect students from campus sexual assaults, because Title IX couldn't really apply to them. That was their argument. And if you go back into the late 1990s, where their president resigned over a horrific scandal where he was accused of having an affair with his son's wife, that woman committed suicide hours after disclosing that alleged affair. Just actually headlined there from way back then. And more recently, where their current president testified before the Michigan State Legislature that he really disliked the state criticizing their diversity, saying, quote, because we don't have enough dark ones, I guess, unquote. That's literally his quote. You can check it out here. There's also College of the Ozarks, considered maybe a model as well. They've been criticized for favoring conversion therapy for LGBTQ students and requiring a freshman course in patriotic education and fitness, which includes military training. That all gives you a hint of the kind of indoctrination that's going on in these education attacks. We need to keep an eye on these executive orders carefully, both to understand the specifics of what's happening, both in the legal realm, as well as the methods in which they're using the executive orders to fit into the overall strategy of the Trump administration. But we're here to keep an eye on it with you and for you, and keep those replies and comments coming. And again, I have found that it's sometimes hard for me to give a reply, particularly if I want to give my link to Blue Sky. YouTube seems to strip it out. So find me on the social media and direct message me, and we can answer some questions, be in touch that way. Thanks, talk to you soon.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.